Hello, everyone. Good evening. Apologies for our late start. Thank you for bearing with us. My name is Lynette Roth, and I'm the Daimler Curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum here at the Harvard Art Museums. And it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to our annual Busch-Reisinger Museum Lecture, tonight with acclaimed academic, artist, and activist Natasha A. Kelly. Our current Reframe initiative in our gallery of German Expressionism on level 1, which really centers on a 1913 painting by Emil Nolde of a black female subject, really builds on Dr. Kelly's critical examination of modern German art and the social context in which it was made in order to address issues of migration, racism, and national identity. In her multimedia projects, Kelly analyzes cliches that objectivize, exoticize, and eroticize Black women while simultaneously telling German history from a Black feminist perspective. And we are really thrilled to welcome her to Cambridge tonight after what it sounds like has been quite an impressive tour throughout our United States. This lecture series is generously sponsored by our German friends of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, and we've actually been hosting this lecture series through the generosity of the German friends since 2005. In addition, modern and contemporary art programs at the Harvard Art Museums are made possible in part by generous support from the Emily Rowell Pulitzer and Joseph Pulitzer Jr. Fund for Modern and Contemporary Art. As we begin today's talk, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. And I should add that this is actually a very exciting evening for us as well because it is the first in-person Busch-Reisinger Museum lecture that we've had since before the pandemic. And we have instead been having monthly conversations on our Instagram channel, which is at Busch_Hall. So I invite you to check out those conversations in the future and our extensive archive of past talks with artists, curators, scholars, and students on the theme of art and identity through the lens of the Busch-Reisinger Museum. And in fact, we've featured a number of Dr. Kelly's projects on our Instagram page, including a number of her publications and her current intervention at the Kunsthalle Bremen. So now I have the great pleasure of turning it over to Dr. Natasha Kelly, who will present her lecture, followed by a brief Q&A, and then we will have the opportunity to screen here in the auditorium her acclaimed 2018 documentary, Millie's Awakening, which has a running time of 47 minutes. So please join me in welcoming Natasha A. Kelly.
Yes, thank you so much, Lynette. Thank you, everybody. First of all, I have to say that it is a true honor for me to be here at the Busch-Reisinger Museum at Harvard University. So from my perspective, especially as a first-generation scholar, first person in my family to actually get a PhD, maybe even to see a university from the inside, Harvard was like so far away. And here I am, standing and talking about my work. See, things happen. Yeah? That said, I would like to present work to you that I've been doing for the past 7 years. When I was preparing this talk, I actually thought that is really a long time. I didn't even realize that so much time had passed. And it literally all started with my film that we're going to circle back to at the end and look at the end. This film's called Millie's Awakening, or Millie's Erwachen in German. And it's a documentary film where I interview these 8 black German artists about their role and their understanding of art and how they use art to position themselves, to identify, or if they even consider art as a healing method, healing tool. All of them do different forms of art. That was important for me. So none of them do really the exact same thing, but I'm not going to say too much because you will be watching the film later if you want to. But what is important is that the youngest, she was in her 20s at the time, and the oldest, she was in her 60s. So with this documentary, I spanned 40 years of Black German history in the arts, looking at the role of women and what they do. And while I was interviewing the youngest, you can see up there, she's standing in front of Ernst Ludwig's Kirchner's Schlafende Millie, the Sleeping Millie. We were at the Kunsthalle Bremen, where she had an art installation, and I was filming her art installation, which is part of her artist portfolio. And then we were all of a sudden standing in front of this painting. And as you know, the Expressionists are very, let me say, I don't want to say violent because that would be too negative, but they're very kraftvoll, the German word would be. I don't know how to translate that right now. Powerful. It's very strong, very deep, dark colors, as you can see here. It's even if you're standing in front of the painting, I think it's not transported digitally, yeah. But we both. It literally cast a spell on us, and we were struck by this painting because the exhibition was actually on German colonialism, you know? And the curator at the time, Julia Binter, she was trying to reflect on the blind spots of colonial history and trying to fill in the gaps, fill in the narratives. As many of you might know, Germany had numerous colonies in Africa, Asia, and the South Sea. It was at a time in the 19th century, actually the 3rd biggest colonizing state after France and the UK. But Germany lost its colonies after the First World War. So today, not many people really understand Germany to be a colonial state, yeah, as they would France or England, you know, especially France maybe. You still have départements in the Caribbean, right? So it's so this whole understanding, it was really, but you still have ongoing effects of colonialism in Germany on many different levels, in language for sure, but also in the visuals, in arts, in knowledge and representation systems in general, the way the black body is actually perceived, the stereotypes you have on stage, in media. These all literally are come from the time of colonialism, and nobody is really criticizing them or has been criticizing them for the longest part of time, because nobody really reconnects to colonialism. And then there was the 12 years of National Socialism. It's like a past that Germany is still trying to get over and trying to let's say communicate, cooperate in schools, in books, in museums. This will always be an ongoing thing. So it hardly was ever the case that we really go back to colonialism, which is actually really important, because to understand National Socialism fully, you have to understand German colonialism. Just to give you a short example, I don't want to go too deep down into the whole colonial history right now, but because this painting is from 1911, which was the height of German colonialism, we have to understand the setting in which it really was created and produced. And after losing its colonies, Germany literally also deported many black people from the country. So in comparison to other cities, we also have a very small community. And Germany's often imagined as being white. And this idea of whiteness actually goes back to colonialism, goes back to the so-called mixed marriage laws, where it was actually forbidden that Africans and Europeans get married. If a white German would marry an African man, she would actually lose her German nationality. So it was also a gender aspect that was in there as well. And the Brücke-Künstler, this Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, you see at the side here, he painted Millie, and I was asking myself when I was standing at the museum how they actually met. Why, as early as 1911, this black woman is lying naked on his couch. You know? How he even got to how Millie got to Kirchner's studio, where they met. You know, was she there on her own free will? We were in the midst of colonialism, so what was actually the context? Yeah, and I started in producing my film asking so many questions already. Yeah, go back a step because as you will see later, Massiré then performs a piece in front of this painting, where we said to ourselves, we really have to awaken her. We have to awaken her in the sense that we need to write her history, tell her story, you know? And after doing my documentary, or as you will see later, I then started really searching for her, practically parallel, looking to see where I could find different information about her, yeah? As a sociologist or communication scientist, I wasn't really interested in Kirchner, his painting, his paintbrushes, and which paint strokes he does, like art historians would, which is great, right? I was more interested in the whole social context of art. So Kirchner himself actually came a point of my observation. So I was looking at the artist in correspondence with his artwork. That's what I look at, so to say. And was asking myself if he also went to the colonies, because we do know from many of the expressionists that they sailed out, like Emil Nolde, he went to Papua New or Max Pechstein went to Palau, even Paul Klee went to, that was not the German colonies, but he did also go to Tunisia and Egypt. And so they all actually went into Africa or Asia or different parts of the world to be influenced, so their art would be influenced. And Kirchner did not. He was literally one of the few artists of the time that did not sail into the colonies, did not go out to sea, so to say. And this is what actually made him interesting for me, because I was not really interested in when white men sail to see what they see and how they paint bodies of color, so to say. But I was interested to follow his gaze to see what he saw in Germany at the time. So it was really about writing Black German history by analyzing Kirchner's works and seeing or literally contextualizing what he portrayed, which he could only have seen in Germany. Yeah, Millie he could only have met in Germany. In comparison to Nolde, he could not have gone to wherever, Cameroon or Tanzania or she has to have been in Germany. That means, because we know that this painting was painted in Dresden, that's in today's East Germany, in 1911, she had to have been there. So these were the steps that I followed through where Kirchner went. I could follow literally where he had met all these black bodies and these black beings, you know? That's literally how this whole thing started, how I started searching for her. Millie, the Sleeping Millie is actually a double painting, and this is the back side of the painting. This, I think, is really important to say. And on the front side, we have also a woman of color, probably Asian, or at least the fan that she's holding symbolizes that she comes from Asia. And these are literally criteria that Kirchner deliberately puts in his pictures. So nothing was a coincidence with Kirchner. And I think that's also really important to understand. as we can actually see by the elements in the painting, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit when it comes to my exhibition in Bremen, it's there's been so much scholarly work done on Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. He, on the white models, there's a lot of literature. He also portrayed many children, also naked children. And there's a lot of scholarly work being done about that. But when I started searching, there was hardly anything on his black models, anything at all. And this also says something about the importance of black bodies, A, in academia, and B, in the arts, right? That we're very likely to be objectified, but an understanding of what this might actually mean in a social context was not, I would say we were not good enough, we were not relevant enough up to now. I remember holding a talk in Davos, in the Kirchner Museum in Davos, and there was a group of young students who said, but she is exactly like the Olympia by Manet. And I said, no, absolutely not, because the Olympia is a white naked woman. And they were trying to argue that is exactly the same thing. And I said, no, because you're trying to erase race out of the whole context, which is an important part of this history, as you will see further down my talk. Kirchner's depiction of Millie, reveals a lot about the social structures of his time. On the one hand, Kirchner's gaze itself becomes a visual discourse. And there have been many scholars in different fields of work that have actually analyzed the gaze, be it the male gaze from Laura Mulvey in film theory, or the white gaze by Toni Morrison in literary theory, or the imperial gaze by E. Ann Kaplan in post-colonial theory. So looking at the visual actually as a discourse allows to rewrite Black German history, and that is practically what I started to do, because there's definitely no ending to what it was like opening the Pandora box, no? And then it was just one figure after the other that popped up with a new story, with a new tale to follow. But I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute too. So I started asking myself who was Millie, because I'm also a performer. So I do theater, I direct theater, I do spoken word, and I was asked a year after producing my film. So we're now in 2019 from the Maxim Gorki Theater in Berlin to do a commentary on Millie's awakening. And for me, it was important to do a creative performative commentary on it, where I actually asked, this is the whole poem, but I only, or spoken word text or performance, whichever way you want to phrase it, where I only highlighted a few points that I want to go into before I show you the short film that came out of this whole performance piece. I asked myself, what is the black body's worth? Because if we, looking at the missing analysis of black bodies in art, although Millie in this painting is so present, Kirchner gives her so much space in this work. Why would she not have been important for him? She would have otherwise been in the background or something, but she's really out front. So what is the black body's worth? What is the value of the skin I live in? This is what I was asking myself, if this is still the same way that we're perceived or deperceived or not perceived, if you want to put it that way. And looking at all these different forms of gazes, the male gaze, the white gaze, the imperial gaze, the question then became, when will the white gaze actually be divorced from the skin? Because it's like tiptoeing across our skin. As Bell Hooks says, the black female body especially becomes a discourse terrain upon which stories are told. So we might want to ask ourselves whose story is actually being told. I'm going to show you the short film that came out of this whole performance venture that we then did at the theater, asking, well, the title of this is Millie's Rising. So after awakening her, we wanted to make her rise. Let me leave it at that. So, this is actually the last sequence of the film, and the dancer, Natasha A, she reenacts a sketch also by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, which was drawn a few years before Millie, the Sleeping Millie, and is titled Millie Telling a Story. So this is why I actually asked whose story is actually being told, and it opens a new entry point, literally to walk into the next chapter of this book. Let's call it that for now, by giving her also moving her from the object who was lying on the sofa, just being stared at, gazed at, to actually a body who actively who becomes active in what she does. By telling a story, namely, she's no longer the object, but she's actually the subject who can speak. Yeah? And I think in comparison to the earlier Millie, who was lying on the sofa, had a smile on her face, we weren't even sure if she was actually sleeping, but the title of the painting implies that we were supposed to make believe that she is sleeping. And here, she's in action. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner holds the movement in the way she stands. This is something that he would also quite often do. He tried to capture movement in his paintings and his sketches, but this also gives her an active voice, makes her an active voice, and allows to look into another chapter of Black German history and look at other ways of literally seeing and understanding the gaze. And this, I think, is literally where Black feminist theory comes into my work, through Bell Hooks, for example, who in the early 1990s had already coined the term of the oppositional gaze or the counter gaze, which she related to the history of enslavement, where Black people weren't allowed to look back. It was obligatory to look on the floor when white people passed, for example, and looking back was an act of resistance. And she's also said, so this counter gaze, this oppositional gaze, has now become an action. It's become an act of resistance, other than just being gazed at, you know? And only recently, in 2021, Tina Kampt, in art theory, she coins the term the black gaze. And I hadn't heard of this before when I started this whole project, but I literally think that this is actually the point where my work starts, with the black gaze and trying to figure out a new way of seeing, shifting the gaze beyond the stereotype. It's not about not seeing the stereotype and not accepting or understanding that there were colonial and racist stereotypes, but going beyond that and looking if we understand that, and if we understand that Germany was a colonial empire, and that there were certain ways that white people would look at black bodies, as mentioned earlier, how can we look beyond that? And this is what my work, for example, in Bremen, in the Kunsthalle Bremen, tries to do. This is where the painting, The Sleeping Millie, is actually located. In the Kunsthalle Bremen, it's a really old art organization. I think they're celebrating 200 years this year, something like that. not that I say wrong, or even 300, I'm not sure, but it's some kind of centennial that they're celebrating this year. So it's really been a private institution, a private museum, not a state museum. And I think that is really, to understand the structures also of the whole institution, museums institution, is really important. Why this painting also has this like a major role in this institution, yeah? Or plays a major role in this institution. And so next door to where she's standing, or where Millie sleeps, there was a small room. They allowed me to visualize my story, visualize my research. I have to say, though, this research, it didn't end, because at the end of the research, another chapter opened, but I'll say about that in a minute. So it was constantly ongoing. All the time when I thought I could answer the question and could now tell you the story of who Millie was, something else popped up, where I was like, okay, this is amazing. So it's literally ongoing. And here in this image, as I mentioned before, we tried to recreate, or my idea, or the conceptual idea, was to recreate Kirchner's studio, because this was 100% clear that Millie was in this studio. So I took different elements from the picture, for example, the blue screen that you see behind Millie, where she's lying, and we recreated that. We made that into a screen that is actually in the room. And we took the bed that she's lying on. There's been a lot of research done about this bed. It's quite astonishing that there's tons of books have been written about this bed, because it's actually from Cameroon and it has wheels on it. You can't see it now, but it's because the red blanket is lying over it. And this is what we try to, if you look at the top left, try to recreate. That this, to get the idea of you're now entering into the same space where Millie was. On the top right hand, we, well, actually it was to solve a problem, because there was another back room that let light in, and we recreated the curtains that Kirchner also has in his studio, and put them at the top right. You can see. Maybe you'll one day make it to Bremen and see it in original. It's been extended, so you have the chance till summer to go and see it. But one of the actual findings, and I think this was the most important point, is that there is not only one Millie, there are several Millies. And this is why, I don't know if you notice, I'm always writing in exclamation marks, because Millie, there is not one Millie who I can identify as she did this, she did that, or had this or that biography, but it was in numerous pictures where you see black women. These are all different women. You can see the different body forms, different hair structures, different phänotypische Merkmale, phenotypical features. So they're literally different black women, but they're all called Millie. Yeah. So I was questioning if Millie might have even been a nickname for black women at that time. I looked at the works of Kirchner from about spanning 30 years. Yeah. So when he was in Dresden with the Sleeping Millie, in his early years, then he left from there to Berlin, then he went from Berlin to Switzerland, to Davos. And in Davos, where he lived with his partner, Ernst Schilling, they had a housekeeper, and her name was Millie too. And I found this in his diary entries and letters that he was writing to his girlfriend, saying that, oh, we need to teach Millie to clean up properly. Everything that she cleans, I have to go and clean it again. No? So this was part of him talking to his girlfriend or partner about the housemaid called Millie, who wasn't doing her work correctly. Yeah? So this was another Millie, and this was 30 years after the painting Sleeping Millie had been produced or had been created. So the question is, are they even talking about the same Millie? Are even the Sleeping Millie and the Millie telling a story, are these two the same Millie? I believe not, because I believe that the erzählende Millie, you can see here that Millie telling a story, she's much younger, she's much slimmer, she's much our Millie we have here, yeah, who is more corpulent. She's lying on a couch. She's, yeah, we don't know if she's sleeping or not, yeah. A further result was looking through Kirchner's biography is that we know he used to like to go to varieté shows, to circus shows, and also to human zoos, which was well, I'm not going to say normal because it wasn't normal, but it was very colonial at the time, let me put it that way. And there he did numerous sketches, his 15-minute sketches, as they were called, because he was trying to capture movement. So some of his sketches is about really drawing fast and not clearly. And in these sketches, there are numerous sketches which are on one wall. He calls them all Millie. So this is what we do know is that many Africans did participate in these Völkerschau. Yeah, we know them by name also. So this could have been also a parallel where he's going into these human zoos, but just calling them Millie, just to mark them, just to name them. No, but at the same time taking away our identity, taking away their identity, taking away their personal identity that up to this project nobody really cared about practically. Yeah. So also this lithography was one of the really important ones because up to that point, this was one of the first works of Kirchner where two black women turned up at the same time. So this actually proved that there was more than one. Yeah, because up to that point, everybody really thought there was only one Millie, no? And her partner was named Sam. This is Sam sitting in the middle. And in comparison to Millie, you can always recognize Sam. In the sketches, in the paintings, in Kirchner's photographies, it really is the long face, the features where you say, oh, that is really, really Sam. But you cannot recognize Millie. And sometimes, and I'll come to Nelly a bit later, there's another second black female model named Nelly who also then appeared, yeah, during my research, but she must have been around at the time too. Here we see, no, that was one too much. Here we see one of the photographies of Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, and down in the corner, the left corner, you see Millie trying to, well, maybe Millie, I'm going to say Millie, yeah, in exclamation mark, trying to hide, trying to not be captured by Kirchner's gaze, and in this case, the technical photography or the camera gaze. And many, or the little bit of research that I found on Millie, always in connection with Sam though, were that they were circus artists, but I was in different circus archives that could not be confirmed, so I'm not sure where this information is actually from. I'm still looking. Others say that they were jazz dancers. Others say that they were from the USA, jazz dancers coming from the USA. The possibility is also that she came from one of the colonies, or both of them came from the colonies. It's not even clear if that is Millie, so if Millie was actually the partner of Sam, or if this is another black woman who was the partner of Sam. But here it's clear that that is Sam, where you really can put the sketch to his face. Yeah, I think that also, like I mentioned earlier, Kirchner never did anything that was coincidental. All of his features, his depictions were all instrumental. So they were all, well, I wouldn't say planned, but very, none of them were coincidental. These are two sculptures from him, where I also say that the left one might be, or I asked, is it a black woman with her hair growing up in an afro, which is no coincidence if you put this other sculpture next to her where the hair is literally growing down, right? Which is a typical phenotypical feature, hair, very political when it comes to black women, yeah? And this was also not coincidental, where he calls her the dancer. I didn't want to translate the titles of these pictures because I know that there are some English titles that exist, but I think in translation a lot goes missing. So what it says here is dancer with a necklace at this part, where again it's people are invited to understand that this woman he features, or female object he features, might be a dancer. Again, the story of the varieté, of the circus, of the establishment's entertainment, where black, especially women, would work, or in the household. These were two jobs where you would see us, but seldom in anything else. Yeah. Oops. My last example that I brought from you from the exhibition, and there are many more in this whole visual essay that I put up, but I think that this one is one that really struck me, I think, a lot, where Millie is commodified. She's literally made into a chair. What we know about Kirchner is that before he did his paintings, he would always make sketches of the paintings, and then from the sketches he would paint. Yeah. So on this sketch, on the left-hand side, it doesn't even look like a chair at all. It looks like that Frenzy. We know this is Frenzy. There's been a lot of research done on this young girl. It looks like she's sitting on a naked woman's lap, not necessarily on a wooden chair, as the title suggests. Yeah, but in the second picture, this body then really is commodified and it becomes a chair. So in the painting itself, it's then she has moved away then from being the object further down to being the abject, right? To being commodified, to being misused, to make or to be the model of this wooden chair that actually exists in Kirchner's house where he lived in Switzerland, I think is where he made it, you know? And this, although the Brücke artists were very much against the moral traditions and conservative understandings of their time, you can see that they're very much tied up in this whole colonial mindset, the whole colonial thinking, especially when it came to black bodies, black female bodies, yeah? So on the one hand, they were trying to get out of this whole conservative establishment, no, against the bourgeoisie, but at the same time they were reproducing the same mind patterns, the same structures, you know? And these mind patterns and structures is what allows you to read along the lines, so to say, and look at the grain. Because I really couldn't answer the question, wer war Millie, in the sense that Millie was, I then curated a group exhibition titled I Am Millie, no? And I invited some of the artists from my film, which you will see later, to show their works, but also other black women from Germany to show their work, literally taking on this idea, okay, I am Millie. She was definitely our ancestor. We stand in her footsteps in a certain way, up to a point that I would say we haven't fully reached freedom, but we are and have moved away from the abject to the object and are in a subject position, fighting in our position, sometimes using art even as resistance against ongoing coloniality. And this exhibition was shown an hour away from Bremen in Osnabrück, so further south, in an art gallery. And I do have one copy left of the catalogue, if anybody's interested, which I then coined the iconographies of black feminism. So we literally were at the intersection not only of art and theory, or of theory and practice, but also at the intersection of race and gender. These are the things that we all had in common, and tried to recreate this space without looking at the power structures, looking at coloniality, but going beyond, looking at racism, but going beyond that. and I'm not meaning this in a colorblind sense. I think that it's really important to understand what racism is and where the structures lie and how racism affects black people, people of color, but also white people, albeit in a very different way. But nonetheless, in Germany, we tend to stop there. And that gets tiring, especially for people who are affected by racism. And the question is then, how can we even move beyond that? And this is what we were trying to do in this exhibition, to actually show, okay, if we start telling a story at a different point, where we stand at exactly this intersection, then what would our stories be? Who is actually Millie? How can we even recreate her identity through the arts? And that is what this group exhibition was about. So it was literally a contemporary answer to the historical question of who Millie was. And I bring one example for you. I could have chosen anything, but because I've been working with this from Ingrid Mwangi Hatta for quite some time, I wanted to give you an example from this exhibition of how these women were working, especially also with their bodies. This is what Ingrid, she's born in Kenya, so she's Kenyan German. Born in Kenya, grew up in Kenya, but came to Germany when she was a teenager. And she uses her body to question social and political concepts, body concepts, but also power concepts and knowledge concepts, obviously. And she tanned her body, so she, on the one hand, has a symbol of the Schablon of Germany, and then or tans Germany, and on the other she has the Schablon of Africa, of the African continent. And it's quite interesting how Germany gains in size, yeah, and becomes the same size as the African continent, although we know Germany would fit in how many times into the African continent. But this is also a reflection, because she writes in it the burnout country. So she's showing how this burnout actually influences the body, right? And how much space it takes up on the body, on the black body, whereas Africa is the bright, dark continent. She is at ease, no? Is this something that gives her, I'm wanting to speak German to you again, but I hope you can follow my my English. During this exhibition, maybe it's because I'm a communication scientist and film is just such a really important media, I am going to try and show you my second film, a short film that we created at this exhibition. And I'm not going to tell you more about it because I think it's really important that you see, and then I'll tell you why we did what we did, if it works. So, okay, so there you go. At the end of my exhibition, I bumped into this photo. So this was the last picture that I have in the visual essay. And, oh, what happened? No, stay there. So this is ein Frauenbildnis, or a portrait of a woman. And this was the first time, or actually one of the only pictures, where a black woman was fully clothed from head to foot in the works of Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. And I found that that was also an astonishing difference to the Sleeping Millie, which was literally portrayed in the same year as this. So it's not even that there was some kind of development between the years. It's literally the same year. It looks like she's in a cafe, so some kind of établissement where she is of higher class, because I believe in that time, black people would not have been able to afford to go to a cafe necessarily unless they came from the colonies, because we do know that those the Africans that were in Germany at the time, they actually belonged to the elite. They belonged to the richer African family. They were kings, they were queens, they were counselors. It wasn't necessarily poor Africans who came to Germany, and this could be signaling that, her elite heritage. And after answering the question wer Millie war, so I am Millie, Moni Lola, she came as Nelly, she performed. It was really, it was touching how she just reenacted Nelly. So she literally came at the opening, she came into the exhibition stage and space and became a living artwork. No? And then she just walked around and she would look at people, stop, look at the artworks, and then she brought life into this whole debate that we're talking about, in the sense that asking the question, is history really something that is past? Yeah, or are we talking about past futures? So not looking at all of this in a Eurocentric linear way, that this is the beginning and this is the end of something, but then more looking at it in an Afrocentric way, that sight is circular and there's no end and no beginning of anything. So she came as an ancestor, maybe, into this space, bringing in this question of time also. The question of time and questioning time and space. And what we do know of Nelly, because she, in comparison to Millie, or the many Millies that I found, actually has a biography. She was a dancer. We see her here with Zidi Heckel. That was the partner of Erich Heckel, which was one of Ernst Ludwig Kirchner's partners in the Brücke. And we see that in the picture on the far right, that she's trying to teach her how to dance. So she's actually even not only in a subject position, but she also then becomes the educator. She's then not only connected to her body, which was also something very colonial, but then she becomes an intellect, not teaching her how to dance. Zidi's watching what she does, how to dance. And this also tied into her being fully clothed. It gave her a different position in class. She became the grande dame. She became the teacher, the subject, the intellect, so to say, or the intellectual, in comparison to a Millie who was literally lying and waiting to be seduced. We don't know. There's actually a really interesting article from Aishan Malonda, who also just now sung the song in with Nelly, about the way she saw Millie. And I think that is really interesting, because she said, why is she so negative? Maybe she just had good sex. If I'm allowed to say that here in the United States, I don't even know. But maybe she just had good sex and she's just relaxing. And because she has a smile on her face, she's naked. Come on, Natasha, think bigger. And I thought that was a really, really interesting point, because why not? No? What is actually bad about lying naked on a couch if without taking away the whole colonial and racial idea, right? I'm not erasing that. That is still there, it doesn't go away. But there is definitely more to the story if you look beyond the gaze. And it's really interesting how she writes about it and how she manages not to colorblind this, her thesis, but she literally walks through her own biography of dating white men and what that actually meant and how her body reacted to this, etc. I can only, if you speak German, I'm so sorry, but I forgot about that part. But anyway, maybe you do. Last but not least, and then we're back into this day and age. This was, I found also really interesting when you mentioned this, Lynette. I was like, okay, there's another one. No? Drawn shortly after Millie. We don't know her name. The title is very racist. I'm going to leave it at that for now. And it was, for me, it's just so intriguing to, because there are only a few indizien, a few hints in this picture where to look, and I haven't done any of this yet, or maybe I will, maybe I won't, who knows. There are only a few hints of actually where to look and what to look for to find out who she may have been, yeah? But who she is for sure is one of the ancestors of the women that we will see in my film now. And sorry again for all this technical mishap, that was not planned. but I hope you could follow my work anyway. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Questions while we queue up the phone?
Yeah, well, I can do that. Mm-hmm.
Do you want to?
Okay.
So if there are any questions for Natasha Kelly while we queue up Millie's Awakening? Anyone? Okay, sorry.
No worries. Yeah, thank you for your wonderful presentation. It was really, really interesting. I was just wondering, again, there's probably a language barrier. I'm not super fluent in German, but I was wondering about sort of the placement of like subject versus verb, because it's sleeping Millie versus like Millie sleeping. So I wonder if that came up like throughout other pieces that you were studying as well.
Can you hear me like this? Sorry. It is a linguistic thing because that is it's a different sentence structure in German, and I notice that all the time when I'm trying to write an English text, because English people will be, why do you have the verb at that position? Because for me it's like it goes with the flow, so to say, that I want to put the verb in the second position, I think it is. But that is it's just a linguistic difference. It's not necessarily emphasizing that you have to look at the sleeping more, but it is literally how we would articulate. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? If not, I would just make one comment about the Emil Nolde painting, which you can see in our level 1 gallery of German Expressionism, where we are also thematizing the role of colonialism. But I thought it was so fascinating, Natasha, the way that the name Millie, right, has in itself this mutability that you showed. You know, it could be many, many different women, and yet this name becomes somehow a signifier of a certain identity. Whereas in our painting, which uses a term that's now considered derogatory of the mixed race of the subject. You know, I had always thought, well, obviously there's a mutability there because we don't even get a name. And I think it's just fascinating that your research has shown, even with a name, there's so much more to unpack and so much that may remain unknown.
Definitely. And I would really like to emphasize again that my research is not finished and that many names have been recaptured. There's an exhibition going on in Berlin at the moment, zurückgeschaut, so that means looking back, and where they have recapitulated all the names of well, not all, but a lot of the names of the women, black women, and men, or let's say all of the artists in the Völkerschau im Treptower Park. So you really can read their names, their biographies, you can see where some are still missing, where they're really putting the pieces back together. And in a certain way, I'm doing that as well, but I'm looking through a sociological lens of how to even follow the traces, you know, of where they went to even be able to find them. You know? So we can only work in the gaps, and a name says nothing practically. No, either it includes us all, or we don't have a name at all. Like you said, it's which goes with the language as well, because even Millie was spelt with an I. It was spelt with a Y at the end. It was spelt with an I. And it was not necessarily, some of these paintings were named after Ernst Ludwig Kirchner's death by his collectors. So there's that dimension in it as well, that we don't even really know. We only know from the paintings that he actually titled that there is a connection. And many of them we have to take out because they weren't named by him as such. No? And so that also makes it difficult, is literally who's naming these paintings, no? And why do collectors go and long after his death, and titled a picture, painting, sketch, or whatever as Millie, and where they get this information from that might be a Millie, you know. And then I'm back to the question: who is Millie? So it's kind of like, never ending. Okay. Oh, maybe one more question over there before we start.
Okay, we'll do one more, and then we'll cue up the film. I should have stayed up here.
Yeah, you can switch. So, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Thank you for your presentation. I just had one quick question regarding the painting Sleeping Millie. Did it ever come up in your research regarding like if that painting was like painted in a brothel house or something? Because like we see on the right side of that painting, there's like another naked person, like, I don't know, standing or dancing. So like, did it ever come up in a research, like maybe it's a brothel or something?
No, it's actually proven that was his studio because of the elements that are in the painting. Like I said, the screen that is there, that was in his studio. The bed with real wheels, the so-called rollbed or wheel bed, I don't know how you would translate that, that was in his studio. So that's why we know she was in his studio. But what we also know, maybe where you get the idea of the brothel, which is not a wrong idea, is that he would have a lot of naked people in his studio. That we know about Kirchner as well, that he belonged to the nudity scene, right? So he was one of these, I don't know how that translates into English, but it was in that day and age where they would dance naked, run around naked, and he had a lot of visitors in his studio that would, strip naked. And that's what you see in the background, that this whole action that's taking place in his studio, but it is his studio. That has really been proven in art history. Yeah.
Any final questions for Natasha Kelly? There's such a powerful film. Yes, hold on.
Thank you for the talk and the films. These were really fascinating, and I think also as somebody who teaches German art, this is such powerful material that I think is really important to what teaching German art today means as well. My question is about the film. One thing I was really curious about was the number of scenes where we see people walking, sitting, speaking in a kind of natural environment in these city parks. And I was curious if you've thought, how you thought about that scenography, especially in relation to some of what we were talking about with Kirchner and his nudism or naturism, if there's like a way in which these parks, which are not natural spaces, are functioning for you in the film.
No, so I spent with each of these women different number of days. And for me, it was important that we are in spaces where they frequently go to and where they feel comfortable to tell their stories. So it was not necessarily only about depicting something in nature or something. It had nothing to do with that at all. But it was a large matter of trust as well, to have to create a space where they felt comfortable to tell their stories. It was more that, no? So during these days, we would stop the interview in between and just go out, and then the next day we would say, okay, let's go there and there, because that's where I feel, and then the conversation would continue. So it was more like that. And because I also did not want to do talking heads, I thought that was just that would have been boring.
I thought it was interesting too, when we talked earlier, there was the question about German language and how often in the film, I don't know if it's Sandrine now, switching back and forth between German and English and then back again. And you sort of just let them speak in whatever language they felt most comfortable.
Literally, yeah. That was also a part of it, yeah. No, and first of all, I thought about that. Wouldn't it have been more important to do it all in German? But it would have interrupted the flow. So I just let them speak.
I'm here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. How did you choose the artists that you included in this documentary?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first interview that I had was with the last artist that you saw, with Nadu. And as I mentioned before, I'm a theater director, so I had a piece on stage that was dedicated to Mai Ayim, who's an Afro-German poet. And after this performance, she came to us, she came backstage or on stage, and said that, because that day, that morning, there was a full spread in the German newspaper. And it was an interview with me talking about Mai Ayim, interviewed by a black journalist. So it was literally a full spread dedicated to 3 black women, and which is really seldom. That really, really doesn't happen often, especially not in Germany. And then she came, she said, yeah, I read this, I was so surprised. This was the first time in her life that black women had gained so much space in a newspaper, in a daily newspaper, you know? And that's what brought her to the theater, because she wanted to come and see what are we doing, what are we putting on stage. And then she said it was really interesting, so the piece was interesting, the interview was interesting, she said, but you forgot one thing. We were all like, okay, what did we forget? And then she said, yeah, you forgot about us. Because she was when she was in her teens and 20s, that was in the 60s, 70s. And there really isn't much information about the community in these 2 decades. So it literally starts in the 80s onwards, after Audre Lorde came to Berlin. This is what Zari tells that part of the story. When she comes to Berlin and she literally reignites the black community, reignites in that sense that during German colonialism there was always an anti-colonial resistance, there were always black communities petitioning for their rights, etc. So when people talk about black German history, they usually start in the 80s, which is highly problematic for everything that came before, especially for these 2 decades. And then she said, yeah, because you literally forgot about us. You don't tell anything about our generation. And I was like, yeah, that's interesting, because I haven't really found anything about your generation yet, no? And we're literally talking about a different time where you didn't have internet, you didn't have social media. In Germany, we only had 3 TV channels. I don't know how it was here in the US. That's how I grew up. We only had one music series called Formula One, where once a week they would show the charts. So there was no music television, no MTV, no Viva, no cable TV, no satellite, none of all of that. And the medium of the time was radio. No, I don't know who's my age, but we used to tape record from radio. So we used to tape the music. And then it was like the worst thing if the moderator would talk in between the song, then we would have it on our tapes afterwards, right? So that was the era of the mixtapes anyway. And so they already had different organizations at that time. And she was part of the black women's organizations who would regularly have interviews, and radio interviews, give radio interviews, talking about their situation in the 60s and 70s. And none of us had heard of that. Well, I knew nothing about all of this. And then, of course, I started hunting, started searching. I went all the way to look for this radio interview found actually the journalist. She was really old because the series is still going on. This is feminist series on radio that is still there today. And I found the old journalist, and she said, "Yeah, I remember that, but that was back in the 60s, 70s. Everything was analog, yeah. And after the fall of the wall, not everything was digitalized. So it was literally the white man who chose what to be digitalized and what to take into the future and not. And so these recordings of these feminist series, what they used to do back then, they didn't make it. And first of all, I wanted to make a film about these 2 decades, about the 60s and 70s. Now I'm coming back to your question, but I had to open it so that so that I can answer. And in the 60s and 70s, so I started looking for women of her generation. And I actually found quite a few. But they were not willing to tell their stories on camera. And again, it was this medium. No, they were like, camera, no. If you want to write a book, they were fine with that, but a camera in your face. And it was quite surprising because, today we do the selfies and we have cameras are like literally everywhere. They were like, no. And shortly after that, I was at the poetry slam. And that's where I met the youngest. That was Massiré, who was the first. And where she was doing her poetry piece and saying about black women and da-da-da. And I thought, this piece is literally speaking to what I'm talking about in this film. And asked her, I need you in my film. I need to interview you. I need your perspective as a 20-plus-year-old on this topic. And so I had the oldest and I had the youngest. And then I went searching for the generations in between to make it intergenerational in the end. But that was not how it started, no? And some of these women I knew, or I know personally, and others were recommended, because the second choice then was to say, I don't want to only look at theater makers or media makers or painters. I want one of each art form to show the variety and the tool of the medium and art itself. And that's when I started selecting the artists. That's how it came about, so to say. No?
Great, okay. Last question, because sadly we are way over time.
Thank you so much. I found it so interesting, so enriching. I've got a million questions, but I won't ask too many. But I did have a question about the choice of color grading on the film. Mm-hmm. To choose to do it in black and white, and that connected me really to this reference you were making earlier to history, not really as a past, but more as a past future. And then I got thinking about nostalgia and the lens of black and white film. So that was more of an aesthetic question, but then gave me bigger tangents as to why that choice. And then the second question was, as a Londoner, I would love to know if the film is showing anywhere in the UK, and if not, where can we find the film? Is it widely shared? And what is the journey of sharing? Apologies if that's already been mentioned.
No, it hasn't. I would start with your second question, actually, because this film was never made for screenings. And that, I think, is really important, because it was made for the art biennial and not for the film biennial. So it is installed in art installation, so it's usually on loop. That's how it was originally made. So it was on loop, and that's why I also decided to do short films, because in the art biennial, where I produced it for in 2018, it was part of a larger exhibition. And for me, it was important that people could come and go. Now, it had its own room, and there was a bench there, and you could stay and watch it all. But if you were in the midst of understanding the whole exhibition, you would want to come and maybe just watch one piece, go again, see something, and then you could come back. So that's what it was originally made for. It was never made for a cinema setting. And that's why there is no DVD, there is no Blu-ray, or I don't even know technical gadgets, what there are today. And I'm actually still working with it in art context. So it's also part of the exhibition in Bremen that I talked about. It's installed there. All of the films are installed there, so in their context, so to say. And that's where you can find it. No? If you now say you're from the UK and you want to invite me to come to the UK to talk about it and to contextualize it, I'll be more than happy to come. But it's not a film that you will find on DVD. And I think that for me it was really important because that was never the deal I had with these women. No? And in a way, I still feel having to protect them also, and also having to protect these stories that not everybody can interpret into them what they want to, for it to be downloaded online, or I don't even know how, streaming or whatever they have these days, yeah? So that's why, yes, I would love to come to London. I know I haven't been to London yet, but I have been once around the world with this film. I went to Australia, it was shown in India, in all sorts of Europe, in Brazil, and I went on tour here in the US in 2019, so I was in several places, Germany obviously as well, and but I haven't been to the UK yet, so maybe that could be something, yeah? And to your first question, maybe, because yes, it was a conscious choice to make the film black and white as well, because I was breaking the gaze. It had nothing to do with nostalgia, although your interpretation was really interesting, I think. But it was about breaking the gaze and breaking the way that the viewers look at the black body, and really forcing them to listen first, and so listen with your ears and not with your eyes, as I say. No, because usually the gaze is focused on the black body, no? And you're analyzing the body without even hearing what these people say. And I put the color where it belongs, namely in their art. So every time their art pops up, that's where the color would pop up. No, that's where if it was their paintings or if it was their videos in the background, or Patricia, she was folding over a calendar, and then all of a sudden the colors come out of this calendar, and that was more the message that I was trying to put across, that it's to break the gaze, deconstruct the gaze, but not to make it a color blind, but to bring the color in to actually be able to have that question. So why did you do it black and white? Because it's not fully black and white, right? So I was playing. Let's put it that way. No.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us. And I know that you will join me in thanking Natasha Kelly, and that we look forward to seeing how the project continues to develop in the future. But thank you so much for sharing your research and also your films with us tonight.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.